Hello viewers, this is Dr. Muhammad Abul Hasanat, Associate Professor, welcoming everyone to my today's lecture on Introduction of Respiratory Physiology. So let's have a look on the screen. Here you can see the process of respiration at a glance. The very first step of respiration is called the pulmonary ventilation. That is actually inflow and outflow of air between the atmosphere and the lung alveoli, or exchange of air between the lung and the environment. This is called pulmonary ventilation. Then the second step, that is the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lung alveoli and the pulmonary blood. Oxygen entering into the blood from the lung alveoli in exchange of carbon dioxide from blood to the lung alveoli. So this gaseous exchange actually takes place across a very special biological membrane called the respiratory membrane. So later on we will discuss in a very big detail about the respiratory membrane. Then the next step is the transport of these gases through the blood in the various chemical forms. That is, oxygen is transported from lung to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide that is transported from tissue to the lung in various chemical forms. And finally, the oxygen will enter into the tissue cells in exchange of carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is produced as a end product of metabolism, and then it will come out of the cells. So this gaseous exchange across the cell membrane is called internal respiration or cellular respiration. So that is the fourth step, that is the gas exchange between the cells and their surrounding fluid medium. This is called internal respirations or cellular respirations. Now, so what are the major pulmonary functional events? The first step is pulmonary ventilations, followed by diffusion of gases between the alveoli and blood in the pulmonary capillaries, then transport of gases in the blood, then fourth step is gaseous exchange between cells and their fluid medium, that is internal respirations, and finally another events that is called regulations of the ventilation. These are the mainly five major pulmonary functional events. Now, here you can see the figure of the respiratory tract. That is actual respiratory tract actually extends from the nose down to the alveoli. So according to function, the respiratory tract can be divided into two zones. That is conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Conducting zone actually extends from nose to the terminal bronchiole, and then from the respiratory bronchiole to the level of the alveoli. This part is actually called the respiratory zone or functional unit of the lung, or simply called respiratory unit, where the gaseous exchange takes place. Okay, then, so that means respiratory zone, that is begins from the respiratory bronchiole and extends to the level of the alveoli. And conducting zone actually that begins from the nose and extends up to the level of the terminal bronchioles. Okay, there is another subdivision of the respiratory tract where the trachea is considered as generation 0, and then trachea is divided into right and left principal bronchus. They are called the first generations. So according to respiratory tract can be further subdivided according to generations, where the trachea is generation 0, and then generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, up to the level of the 16 generations. That is called terminal bronchiole. Up to the 10th generation, they are actually bronchi. That's so, there's trachea and bronchi. They contain cartilage, secretory gland, especially the goblet cell. Okay, and smooth muscle cells are less. Then bronchioles and terminal bronchiole, this part of the respiratory tract, that means generation 11 to generation 16. This part of the respiratory tract, they contain smooth muscle predominantly, and cartilage and secretory glands are absent in this part of the respiratory tract. This is the main area that may produce the constriction. We know this, the bronchoconstriction, that bronchoconstriction is actually happen in this region, as this part of the respiratory tract contains smooth muscle in their wall. Okay, and then actually from the 17th generation to 23rd generation, there is no cartilage, there is no smooth muscle, no goblet cell. There's only consist of elastic tissues and the layer of epithelium. Okay, now the effects of autonomic nervous systems. Actually, sympathetic nervous system causes constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle. So that sympathetic nervous system causes dilatation of the bronchial smooth muscle as they contain the beta 2 receptors. So it causes bronchodilatations and reduce the bronchial secretion, because the vessels that supplying this part of this respiratory tract, they actually produce constrictions and thereby reduce the secretions. So the effect is reduced bronchial secretion, and the effects of parasympathetic system is completely the reverse. It causes the constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle and increase the bronchial secretions. Okay, so this conducting zone, they do not take part in the gaseous exchange mechanism, and they get the nutrition from the bronchial circulations. But this is the pulmonary zone. It's from the respiratory bronchiole to the alveoli. They are actually the functional unit or functional zone of the respiratory tract where the gaseous exchange takes place. And they receive blood supply from pulmonary circulations. Okay. Now, there is another subdivision of the respiratory passes according to, on the basis of anatomical point of view, that is upper respiratory tracts and the lower respiratory tracts. Upper respiratory tracts actually consist of structures from nose to the vocal cord that include sinuses, glottis, pharynx, and larynx. And the lower respiratory tract, that is below the vocal cord of the larynx to the alveoli of the lungs, and also consists of trachea, airway, and the alveoli. The respiratory apparatus also consists of thoracic cavity and the associated skeletal muscles and the muscles of respirations. Now the functional division of the respiratory passes or tract. I have already shown this division in the previous figure. There is actually two zones, conducting zone and the respiratory zones. So by this time, you know that conducting zone extends from nose to the terminal bronchiole, and in this part of this respiratory tract, cartilage is present up to the 10th generations, and it receives blood supply from the bronchial circulations. So now here, what are the functions of this zone, as they do not take part in gaseous exchange? So what are the functions? They actually carry or conduct air to the site of gas exchange, act as a reservoir of the air, filters, humidifies, and warms the inspired air, serve as a part of non-specific defense system of the body by removing dust, bacteria, and harmful agents. Some important points should be considered. You know, this part contain the cartilage in their all. this is important because this cartilage prevent collapse of this airway during expiratory compressions. Cartilage is totally absent in the bronchioles. They are actually suspended by elastic tissue of the lung parenchyma. However, bronchioles are susceptible to collapse, especially during expirations. So, if there is any disease process that involve this cartilage and the elastic tissue, the person will suffer from respiratory uh, collapse of this respiratory passage during expirations. Now the respiratory zone, that is the functional zone where the gaseous exchange takes place, and this extends from the respiratory bronchiole to the level to the alveoli of the lung, that is 17th to 23rd generations. And this zone receives blood supply from the pulmonary circulation, and it is the function I have already told you. This is the site of gaseous exchange. Now what is respiratory unit? So again, I have already explained it. The functional unit of the lung where gas exchange takes place is called respiratory unit or simply lung unit. So what are the parts? It starts from the 17th generation, that is respiratory bronchioles, then alveolar duct from 20 to 22nd generations, atria, 23rd generations, alveolar sac, that is also 23rd generation, alveoli, 23rd generations. That means 17 generations to 23rd generations, they are the component of the respiratory unit. Actually, there are 300 million of alveoli in two lungs. What are the cells, type of cells that present in the lung alveoli? There are actually three special type of cells. Number one, is called type 1 pneumocyte. These cells are actually simple squamous type of epithelium and that covering 95% of the alveolar epithelial surface area. And the main function of this type of epithelium, they can allow the gas exchange. Type 2 granular pneumocyte that actually constitute 60% of the alveolar cell populations, but they make up only 5% of the alveolar surface area. Okay, because they can interfere the gas exchange mechanism. That is why they only make up 5% of the surface area, but they are very important functions. They are very important in production and secretion of the surfactant. Surfactant is very important. This actually prevents the lung collapse. We will discuss in detail about surfactant in the later classes. And another type of cell that is called type 3. They are actually pulmonary alveolar macrophage or PAM or simply called a alveolar macrophage. Functions, they are actually phagocytic cell. So phagocytosis thereby they can help in lung defense mechanism. Other cells are also present there like lymphocytes, plasma cells, neuroendocrine cells, and the mast cells. Tracheobronchial passages also contain other type of cells like mucus cell, goblet cells, chlora cells. Okay. Now, the concept of dead space and dead space here. Dead space is nothing, it's actually the conducting zone, the anatomical, that is actually also called the anatomical dead space, where the gaseous exchange do not take place. So, dead space, the space in the respiratory passes occupied by gas but do not allow gas exchange. This space is called anatomical dead space. And what is dead space here? The air that is occupied in the respiratory passages that do not take part in gaseous exchange. It is only 150 ml. The types of dead space. There are actually two types of dead space, anatomical dead space and the physiological dead space. I've already told you from nose to terminal bronchioles. They are called, this is the conducting zone. They are called actually anatomical dead space. And I have also mentioned the functions of this conducting tone or anatomical dead space. And here I have mentioned just two important functions: act as a reservoir of the air, filters, humidifies, and warms up the air. Also, they have they are very important in the defense mechanisms. And the physiological dead space, that is called the non-functional alveolar space. Okay, non-functional alveoli means those alveoli having little or no blood supply or damaged alveoli. So this, the volume of air that present in this type of alveoli, they will not take part in gaseous exchange, and the ventilation of this part will be wasted. So how will you calculate the volume of physiological dead space air? Actually, physiological dead space air is equal to anatomical dead space plus non-functional alveolar space or wasted ventilation. We know that anatomical dead space air volume, that is 150 ml. But in case of healthy individual, we consider that all the alveoli are in a functional state. So there will be a no wasted ventilations, or the amount is very, very insignificant. That is why we consider this value is zero in case of healthy persons. So in case of healthy person, this physiological dead space is actually equal to anatomical dead space. If your physiological dead space is increased, it is a good news or bad news? It is a bad news. That means that some of your alveoli get damaged. They are not taking part in the gaseous exchange mechanisms. So that indicates the very bad condition of your lungs. So that is not a good news. So what is the importance of physiological dead space? It gives an indication about the condition of the lung. Another importance of physiological dead space is it indicates ventilation perfusion ratio. So today I'm not going to explain the ventilation perfusion ratio. Later on I will give you a detail about ventilation perfusion ratio. Now there is a equation that can be used to measure the volume of dead space air. That equation is called Bohr equation. So here is the equation where the VD, that is dead space air volume, and partial pressure of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the expired air. This is tidal volume, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of the arterial blood. Okay. Now the functions of the lung. The principal function of the lung, that is the respiratory functions. What is respiratory functions? That is actually the ventilatory functions, and the second important thing is the gaseous exchange functions. So these two are the main respiratory functions of the lung. So lungs have also some other important non-respiratory functions like defensive functions. Do you know this alveolar macrophages? They can phagocytes. They are actually phagocytic cells. So they acts in lung defense mechanism. Also, there are some proteins that are secreted or generated by airway epithelial cells. This secretion can act directly as antimicrobials to help to keep the airway free of infection. What are those chemicals? They are immunoglobulin A, calectins, and defensins. These pulmonary circulations contain a fibrinolytic system that lyses clot in the pulmonary vessels. So they are the natural purifier of the blood. If there is any undue microthrombi in the circulations, that will be filtered by the pulmonary circulation and lysed. Okay, so that is very important. Another important non-respiratory function, that is the regulations of acid-base balance. By regulating the blood carbon dioxide concentrations. Also, it helps in regulation of body temperature. Respiratory tract plays a role in the heat loss mechanism. Maintenance of water balance. During expiration, water evaporates through the expired air and some amount of body water is lost by this process. Another important functions, that is separation of the angiotensin converting enzyme. It converts the angiotensin 1 into active angiotensin 2, thereby regulate blood pressures. Synthesis of some hormonal substances. So lung tissues are also known to synthesize the hormonal substances like prostaglandin, acetylcholine, and serotonin. So, okay, this is enough for today. Thank you very much. The lecture is over.